Shalom, and welcome to Shmu's Views. This week's parsha jam-packs a ton of information in 5 chapters. In this video, we won't cover it all, but take a look at some of the things I find quite fascinating that really stand out as unique to Avraham Avinu and those around him. When Parshat Vayeira opens, Avraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent, in the heat of the day. He's recovering from circumcision, which occurred just 3 days earlier than this event in Torah. And yet, upon seeing 3 travelers, he literally runs to greet them. Genesis 18, verse 2. The sages state in Bereshit Rabbah 48:9 that Hashem himself appeared to Avraham just before this moment, and yet Avraham leaves the divine presence to serve his guests. From this, the rabbis famously conclude, "Greater is hospitality to wayfarers than welcoming the divine presence." Shabbat 127a. This sets the moral framework of the parsha. Avraham's world is defined by chesed and tzedakah, acts of goodness, empathy, and fairness. Contrast this with Sodom, a city where hospitality was considered a crime. The Midrash, Sanhedrin 109a, paints a society that viewed charity as weakness. They believed that helping the poor was an act of rebellion against the natural order, a worldview diametrically opposed to Avraham's covenantal ethos, and sadly, one becoming more familiar in our own world and society of today, one which calls good evil and evil good. When Hashem lets Avraham in on his plans for the future of Sodom and Gomorrah, an interesting thing occurs between him and Hashem, something not witnessed in history before this time. Avraham begins bargaining with Hashem over Sodom, Genesis 18, verses 23 to 33. This is one of the Torah's most remarkable dialogues. Avraham starts at 50 righteous people and negotiates down to 10. The question you may be asking, why stop at 10, is key. Why not 5, or even 1? According to the Midrash Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah 49:13, Avraham reasoned that 10 was the smallest possible number for a community to be considered righteous, known as a tzibur. In later halakhic tradition, the minyan, the quorum of 10 adult males required for public prayer, mirrors this concept, Mishnah Megillah 4:3. But in Avraham's time, the formal institution of a minyan as we know it didn't exist. Rather, the number 10 reflected an archetypal completeness. For example, 10 represents the minimal collective required to sustain a moral community, as seen in the 10 utterances of creation, Pirkei Avot 5:1, and the 10 Commandments. Also, the Zohar in Vayeira 105b adds that fewer than 10 could not form a spiritual vessel strong enough to contain the divine presence. In essence, Avraham's plea recognized that a society's merit isn't judged by its individuals alone, but by the critical mass of righteousness that defines its character. 10 was, using our modern-day vernacular, the red line, the threshold of communal moral survival. Sodom's downfall wasn't just about violence or lust. It was the systemic inversion of moral order. The Talmud in Sanhedrin 109b recounts grotesque laws of Sodom. Hospitality was punishable by death. Helping the poor was outlawed. Visitors were tortured for being different. This is the polar opposite of Avraham's tent, open on all sides, welcoming all travelers. However, Sodom closed its gates, both physically and spiritually. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49 captures the essence. "Behold, this was the sin of your sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and prosperous ease, but she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." In other words, their sin wasn't primarily sexual perversion, as it is usually portrayed in films and sermons. It was ethical perversion, the glorification of selfishness and the destruction of compassion. This mindset had tragically infected Lot and his family to some degree, showing how just a little leaven can invade the whole loaf. And therefore, we now have the troubling scene of when the men of Sodom demand that Lot hand over the visiting malachim or angels. Lot offers up to them his 2 virgin daughters, Genesis 19, verse 8. How could Lot, Avraham's nephew, even think such a thing? Our sages and rabbis have, and still do, wrestle with this intensely. Midrash Rabbah 50:5 explains that Lot had absorbed Sodom's moral confusion. He had learned hospitality from Avraham, but also learned compromise from Sodom. He wanted to protect his guests, a good impulse, but through a horrifying means, a corrupt method. Rashi comments that Lot's reasoning was rooted in the perverse Sodomite law that forbade sheltering guests. In offering his daughters, he was trying to save his visitors' lives under impossible circumstances, but it revealed how morally disoriented he had become. Abarbanel adds that Lot's moral compass was fractured. He prioritized social appearances and self-preservation over absolute moral truth. In other words, compromise holy living in order to get along and be liked by the rabble in control. In short, Lot mirrors what happens when one tries to live halfway between Avraham's world of justice and Sodom's world of cruelty. You can't stand in both camps for long without losing your bearings. The Avraham Sodom contrast is ultimately about what kind of civilization humanity will build. Avraham's descendants are chosen not for privilege, but for purpose. For I have known him that he may command his children to keep the way of Hashem by doing tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and justice. Genesis 18, verse 19. Here, tzedakah doesn't just mean charity, it means righteous giving, the natural outflow of seeing others as made in Hashem's image. Sodom saw that as weakness. The Mishnah, Avot 5:10, classifies 4 attitudes toward possessions. One who says, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine is an ignoramus. One who says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. This is the trait of Sodom. That's the heart of the parsha. Avraham's open tent versus Sodom's locked gates. Compassion versus indifference, the covenantal call to heal the world versus the self-justifying cruelty of isolation. Avraham's story teaches that justice without mercy is tyranny, and mercy without justice is chaos. The survival of any civilization depends on balancing both, something Sodom refused to do, as Avraham's descendants were tasked with carrying that balance forward. And perhaps the question that still hangs over every generation is this: are we more like Avraham's open tent or Sodom's closed gates? Thank you so much for watching this video or reading the blog post. To help others see this as well, please like, subscribe, and most importantly, share. Any comments leave below, or you can email me to shmu@startmail.com. Until next time, this is Shmuel ben Shlomi of Shmu's Views wishing you Shabbat Shalom.